Hi, I'm Jessica Martinez. For 7 years, I believed marriage meant partnership, trust, and building dreams together. Instead, I came home from a successful business trip to find my husband's side of the closet empty, his cologne gone from the bathroom counter, and a pregnant stranger sitting at my kitchen table like she owned the place. The note he left was 3 sentences long. The devastation lasted months. But what I discovered next changed everything. And when I finally fought back, I didn't just reclaim my life. I rebuilt it stronger than he ever thought possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air in Riverside, Colorado always smelled different after rain. Crisp and clean with hints of pine and wildflowers that made you want to breathe deeper. I rolled down the rental car windows as I drove through our neighborhood. Exhaustion from 10 days of client meetings finally starting to lift. The Lake Tahoe campaign had been brutal. 18-hour days convincing resort executives to trust Sterling Marketing with their summer launch. But we'd landed the contract. Robert would be thrilled, and the commission meant Mike and I could finally start looking at that cabin we'd talked about for years. The townhouse came into view, its sage green shutters and stone facade looking exactly as I'd left it, except for the moving truck parked in our driveway. I slowed the car, confusion prickling at the edges of my tired mind. We hadn't scheduled any deliveries, and Mike certainly hadn't mentioned buying furniture while I was away. Maybe it was for the neighbors, though the truck sat squarely in front of our house, blocking the garage. I parked on the street and grabbed my suitcase from the trunk, the wheels clicking against the pavement as I made my way up the familiar brick walkway. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual since Mike often forgot to lock it during the day, but something felt different the moment I stepped inside. The air was wrong somehow, carrying an unfamiliar perfume and the lingering scent of someone else's cooking. My heels echoed on the hardwood as I called out, expecting Mike's voice to boom from the kitchen or his office upstairs. Instead, silence greeted me, broken only by muffled voices coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I set my suitcase down by the stairs and followed the sound, my marketing instincts already cataloging details that didn't belong. A pair of women's shoes by the door that weren't mine, smaller than my size 8s. A purse on the hall table that definitely wasn't from my collection. The voices grew clearer as I approached the kitchen, and I could make out Mike's familiar baritone mixed with a higher, younger voice I didn't recognize. They were discussing something about timing and logistics, the kind of practical conversation you'd have with a contractor or service person. Relief started to replace the unease as I rounded the corner, ready to greet whatever worker Mike had hired to help with some project he'd forgotten to mention. What I found instead stopped me cold in the kitchen doorway. Mike stood with his IT back to me, wearing the navy polo I'd bought him for his birthday, talking animatedly to a petite brunette seated at our breakfast nook. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long dark hair pulled into a messy bun and a face that might have been pretty if it weren't for the obvious discomfort written across her features. But it wasn't her youth or beauty that made my stomach drop like a stone. It was the unmistakable curve of her belly beneath a flowing blouse, the careful way she held herself that spoke of someone well into pregnancy. Mike was saying something about boxes and timing when he noticed the woman's expression change, her dark eyes widening as they fixed on something behind him. He turned, and our gazes met across the kitchen island where we'd shared countless morning coffees and late-night conversations about our future. For a split second, his face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Surprise, guilt, resignation, and finally something that looked almost like relief. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, broken only by the refrigerator's gentle hum and the distant sound of the moving truck's engine idling outside. I stood there in my travel-wrinkled blazer and comfortable flats, suitcase handles still, gripped in my hand, trying to process a scene that made no logical sense. My husband, my kitchen, a pregnant stranger, and an atmosphere so thick with unspoken truths I could barely breathe. Finally, Mike cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the charged quiet. He straightened his shoulders in a gesture I recognized from business presentations, armoring himself for whatever came next. The woman, meanwhile, had started fidgeting with her sleeve, her gaze darting between Mike and me like she was watching a tennis match she desperately wanted to escape. "Jess," Mike said, and even my name sounded different in his mouth, careful and distant. "You're home early." The absurdity of the statement hit me like a physical blow. Early. As if there was a scheduled time for walking into your own home to find your life rearranged without your knowledge or consent. I checked my phone automatically, seeing the same arrival time I'd texted him yesterday. 4:30 p.m., exactly when I'd said I'd be back. My flight was on time, I managed, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. "I texted you yesterday about when I'd be home." Mike's jaw tightened, and he glanced at the woman before looking back at me. There was something in his expression I'd never seen before, a hardness that made him look like a stranger wearing my husband's face. The man who used to surprise me with coffee in bed and leave silly notes in my luggage was studying me like I was an inconvenient problem to be solved. The pregnant woman finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying clearly across the kitchen. "Maybe I should go wait in the car." "No," Mike said quickly, too quickly, and I saw something pass between them, some silent communication that excluded me entirely. "Ashley, this is my wife, Jessica. Jess, this is Ashley Rodriguez." Ashley. The name landed in my consciousness with peculiar weight, as if I should recognize it, though I was certain we'd never met. She offered a tentative smile that didn't reach her eyes and raised one hand in an awkward half-wave. The gesture revealed a delicate gold bracelet on her wrist, and my stomach lurched as I recognized it. Mike had given me the same bracelet for our 3rd anniversary, claiming he'd found it at a small boutique downtown that specialized in unique pieces. "Ashley works at the office," Mike continued, his tone taking on the cadence he used with difficult clients. "She's been helping me with some of the paperwork for the transition." Transition. The word hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. I looked around the kitchen with new eyes, finally noticing what my travel-addled brain had missed initially. The countertops were bare except for Ashley's purse and a stack of papers. The refrigerator door, usually cluttered with takeout menus and appointment reminders, was completely empty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even the small succulent I'd been nursing back to health on the windowsill was gone. "What transition?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer, could feel it crystallizing in my chest like ice forming on a winter lake. Mike ran a hand through his hair, messing up the careful styling he'd adopted since joining the real estate firm 3 years ago. For a moment, he looked younger, more like the man I'd fallen in love with in college. Then his expression hardened again, and that fleeting resemblance disappeared. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you," he began, and I noticed Ashley's hand move protectively to her belly. "Things between us haven't been working for a while, Jess. You're always traveling, always focused on work. We've grown apart." The accusation hit me like a slap. My travel schedule had increased over the past year, but only because Mike had been pressuring me to take on bigger clients, to build the financial security he claimed we needed. Every late night and weekend trip had been about building our future together, or so I'd thought. I'd been sacrificing time and comfort to strengthen our financial foundation while he'd apparently been building an entirely different future. "So you decided to tell me by having your pregnant girlfriend wait here while I came home?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but Ashley flinched as if I'd shouted. "How long has this been going on?" Mike's face flushed, but whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. "It's not what you think. Ashley and we connected over the past few months. She understands what I need in a way that you—" He trailed off, seeming to realize how cruel the comparison sounded. "In a way that I don't." I finished for him, surprised by how steady my voice remained. Inside, something was cracking, but it felt distant, like hearing glass break in another room. And the baby? Ashley spoke up for the first time since the introduction, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 months. 4 months. I did the math automatically, my marketing brain cataloging timelines and overlaps. 4 months ago, I'd been in Phoenix for a resort chain pitch, gone for nearly 2 weeks. Mike had seemed supportive, even proud when I'd called to tell him we'd won the contract. He'd suggested we celebrate when I got home, had made dinner reservations at our favorite restaurant. We'd talked about using the bonus to finally start trying for kids of our own. The memory felt surreal now, like something that had happened, to someone else entirely. While I'd been working 18-hour days to secure our future, he'd been creating a completely different one with someone else. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly executed, that part of me almost admired the thoroughness of it. "Where are you going?" I asked, noting the obvious preparations for departure all around me. The house felt hollow, stripped of the personal touches that had made it ours rather than just a place to sleep. "Denver," Mike said, not meeting my eyes. "Ashley's from there originally, and David's been wanting to expand the business. It makes sense for all of us." David Kim, his business partner, who'd always struck me as somewhat sleazy during office parties and company dinners. I wondered if he knew about Ashley, if this expansion had been planned around Mike's affair, or if it was just convenient timing. Either way, it was clear this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision. They'd been planning this exit strategy, while I'd been working myself to exhaustion for what I thought was our shared benefit. The moving truck outside suddenly made perfect sense. Mike hadn't been receiving a delivery. He'd been loading up his life and taking it somewhere else. Somewhere that included Ashley and the baby she carried, but had no room for the wife who'd helped build everything he was now walking away with. I looked around the kitchen again, noting the empty spaces where our shared belongings used to be. The coffee maker we'd received as a wedding gift was gone. The set of knives I'd saved up to buy him for Christmas had vanished from the magnetic strip. Even the small framed photo of us from our honeymoon in Maui had disappeared from its spot, near the window. "How much are you taking?" I asked, my voice still unnaturally calm. Mike shifted uncomfortably, finally showing some sign of the man I'd thought I'd married. "Just my personal stuff and a few things I need for the new place. The house is in both our names, so you'll need to decide what you want to do about that." What I wanted to do. As if discovering your husband's double life was just another item on a to-do list, something to be handled efficiently between other errands. I wondered how long he'd been rehearsing this conversation, how many times he'd practiced this clinical delivery of devastation. Ashley cleared her throat softly, drawing both of our attention. "I'm sorry," she said, and there was genuine distress in her voice. "I know this is awful timing. Mike said you'd be in meetings until tonight." Until tonight. So this whole scene had been choreographed to avoid exactly this confrontation. Mike had planned to be gone before I returned, leaving me to discover his absence gradually, rather than facing the messiness of an actual goodbye. The cowardice of it was almost more insulting than the affair itself. "Well," I said, setting my purse down on the counter with deliberate care. "Here I am." The simple statement seemed to deflate something in Mike's posture. He glanced at his watch, then at Ashley, clearly calculating how much longer the moving truck would take, and whether they could still escape this scene without too much drama. But I wasn't planning to make a scene. I was still too stunned, too overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what I was discovering to properly react. 7 years of marriage, 3 years of careful financial planning, countless conversations about our future together, and it was ending with a stranger sitting at my breakfast table while my husband loaded his new life into a truck. The casual brutality of it was almost impressive in its thoroughness. "Is there anything you want to say?" I asked Mike, genuinely curious what words he thought might be appropriate for this moment. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw a flicker of something that might have been regret cross his features. But then Ashley shifted in her chair, her hand moving to her belly again, and his expression closed off once more. "I left some papers on the dining room table," he said finally. "Information about the accounts and the mortgage. You'll want to talk to a lawyer about the divorce proceedings." Divorce proceedings. He'd already been thinking that far ahead, had probably already consulted his own attorney to make sure he was protected. I wondered how long he'd been planning this, how many months or even years of our marriage had been an elaborate performance while he built his exit strategy. The sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch announced the return of the movers, and Mike visibly relaxed at the interruption. "That's probably the last of it," he said, moving toward the hallway. "Ashley, we should get going if we want to. Miss Traffic." Ashley stood carefully, her hand still pressed to her belly, and I found myself staring at the visible proof of Mike's betrayal. In a few months, there would be a baby with his eyes or his stubborn chin, a living reminder of how thoroughly he'd dismantled our life together. The child would never know me, would grow up thinking of Mike as a man who'd left his first wife for love rather than a man who'd cheated his way into a second chance. "Jessica," Ashley said quietly, and I looked up to meet her eyes. "For what?" I really am sorry. This isn't how I wanted things to happen." There was sincerity in her voice, and I realized she was probably as much a victim of Mike's choices as I was. She was young, pregnant, and about to build a life with a man who'd proven he could walk away from promises without looking back. In a year or two, when the novelty wore off and she was dealing with sleepless nights and baby stress, would she find herself wondering if he was already planning his next escape? "Take care of yourself," I told her, and meant it. Whatever anger I had was for Mike, not for the woman who'd gotten caught up in his midlife crisis. Mike reappeared in the kitchen doorway, car keys jingling in his hand. "The movers are done," he announced, then looked at me with what might have been expectation. "I guess this is it." I studied his face, searching for some trace of the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd proposed on a hiking trail outside town because he knew I loved watching the sunrise over the mountains. That man seemed to have vanished completely, replaced by this stranger who could casually destroy a marriage and walk away without apparent remorse. "I guess it is," I agreed. He hesitated for a moment, as if waiting for me to break down or beg, or provide some dramatic scene he could use to justify his choices. When I remained silent, he nodded once and turned to leave. Ashley followed, pausing at the doorway to look back at me with something that might have been sympathy or regret. "Good luck," she said softly. Then they were gone, leaving me alone, in the kitchen that no longer felt like mine. I could hear the moving truck starting up outside, the sound of my husband driving away to start a new life with someone else. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of Mrs. Hayes watering her garden next door. I stood there for several minutes, still wearing my travel clothes, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought was solid and permanent. The papers Mike had mentioned were presumably waiting on the dining room table, full of legal terminology and financial details that would formalize the end of everything we'd built together. But I wasn't ready to look at them yet, wasn't ready to start dealing with the practical aftermath of betrayal. Instead, I walked slowly through the house, cataloging what remained and what had vanished. The living room furniture was mostly intact, though his recliner and gaming console had disappeared. Our bedroom felt cavernous with his dresser gone and half the closet empty. The bathroom counter looked sparse without his cologne and electric razor cluttering the space. In his office, formerly our office, only my desk remained. His computer, his files, even the small cactus I'd given him as a joke about his ability to kill plants, everything was gone. It was as if Mike Thompson had simply evaporated, leaving behind only empty spaces and the lingering scent of someone else's perfume. I ended up back in the kitchen, staring at the breakfast nook where Ashley had sat looking uncomfortable and pregnant. The morning sun was slanting through the windows differently now, casting long shadows across the floor. In a few hours, this would just be another ordinary evening in Riverside. But my entire world had shifted on its axis. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Rachel, asking how the trip had gone and whether I wanted to grab dinner to celebrate the new contract. I stared at the message, trying to figure out how to explain that everything had changed while I was away, that the life she thought I was living had apparently ended months ago without my knowledge. Another text came through, this one from Lauren Chen, my college roommate who'd stayed in town to practice family law. Coffee tomorrow? I have gossip about the Peterson divorce that will make your head spin. Lauren. I'd known her for over a decade, had been maid of honor at her wedding, had celebrated when she'd passed the bar exam. If anyone could help me navigate what came next, it would be her. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, needed to see those papers Mike had left, and figure out just how thoroughly he'd planned his escape. I walked to the dining room on unsteady legs, finding a manila folder sitting in the center of the table where we'd shared thousands of meals. Inside were bank statements, insurance policies, mortgage documents, and a business card for a law firm I didn't recognize. Everything was organized with the same efficiency Mike brought to his real estate deals, complete with color-coded tabs and sticky notes explaining various details. As I flipped through the pages, a more complete picture of his deception began to emerge. The joint savings account we'd built together had been systematically drained over the past 3 months, with transfers I'd never authorized moving money to accounts I'd never seen. Our shared credit cards showed charges in Denver dating back 6 months, hotels and restaurants, and purchases that painted a picture of someone building a second life while maintaining the facade of the first. But it was the final document that truly took my breath away. A quitclaim deed, already notarized and filed, transferring Mike's interest in our house to me alone. At first glance, it looked generous, like he was giving me the home we'd bought together. But a closer reading revealed the trap hidden in his apparent generosity. By transferring ownership to me, he'd also transferred responsibility for the mortgage payments, property taxes, and maintenance costs. He'd kept half the equity while dumping all the ongoing financial burden on my shoulders. It was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, designed to look fair while ensuring I'd struggle financially in his absence. He knew my travel schedule made it difficult to maintain a house, knew the mortgage payments would stretch my budget without his real estate income to help. He'd set me up to fail, to lose the home we'd built together because I couldn't afford to keep it alone. The scope of his planning was breathtaking. This hadn't been a moment of weakness or a sudden decision driven by passion. This had been a months-long campaign to extract himself from our marriage while maximizing his advantage and minimizing his losses. Every kind gesture in recent months, every supportive comment about my career, had been part of an elaborate performance while he systematically dismantled our shared life. I set the papers down with hands that had started to shake, finally understanding the true magnitude of what I was facing. Mike hadn't just left me for someone else. He'd robbed me, manipulated me, and set me up for financial ruin, all while maintaining the pretense of being a loving husband. The betrayal was so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that it took my breath away. But as I sat there in the dining room where we'd planned our future over Sunday morning coffee, something else began to stir beneath the shock and pain. A cold, clear anger that cut through the emotional fog like a blade. Mike had underestimated me, had assumed I'd be too devastated or too confused to see through his manipulations. He'd counted on my trust, my love, my tendency to give him the benefit of the doubt. He'd made a very serious mistake. I pulled out my phone and scrolled. To Lauren's contact, my fingers steady as I typed a response to her earlier text. Rain check on coffee. I need to hire you instead. Can you come over tonight? I'm about to need the best divorce attorney in Colorado. As I hit send, I felt something shift inside me, a gear clicking into place that I hadn't even known existed. Mike thought he'd won, thought he'd executed the perfect escape plan. But he'd forgotten one crucial detail about the woman he'd been married to for 7 years. I'd built my career on turning impossible situations into victories, on finding advantages where others saw only obstacles. Mike had just handed me the biggest challenge of my life, and he was about to discover that underestimating Jessica Martinez was the worst mistake he'd ever made. Lauren arrived within an hour, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern as she stepped through the front door carrying a bottle of wine and a legal pad. She'd changed out of her courtroom attire into jeans and a sweater, but her sharp eyes were already scanning the house, taking in the empty spaces and hollow feeling that pervaded every room. "Show me everything," she said without preamble, settling at the dining room table where Mike's carefully organized documents still lay spread like evidence of a crime. Lauren had built her reputation on handling high-conflict divorces with surgical precision, and I could see her shifting into professional mode as she examined each paper. I poured 2 glasses of wine while she worked, watching her expression grow progressively grimmer as she absorbed the scope of Mike's financial maneuvering. When she reached the quitclaim deed, she actually whistled low under her breath, a sound I'd never heard from her in all our years of friendship. "This is sophisticated," she murmured, making notes on her legal pad. "He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. The timing of these transfers, the way he's structured the property transfer to maximize your burden while protecting his assets. This isn't amateur hour." I settled into the chair across from her, feeling strangely detached from the conversation. It was surreal to discuss the dismantling of my marriage like a business transaction, but Lauren's clinical approach was exactly what I needed. Emotions would come later. Right now, I needed strategy. "How bad is it?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from her expression. Lauren set down her pen and looked at me directly, her voice gentle but unflinching. "Financially? He's put you in a very difficult position. The mortgage payments alone will eat up most of your base salary, and if you're traveling as much as you have been, maintaining this house will be challenging. He's also cleaned out most of your liquid savings, though we can potentially recover some of that depending on how aggressive we want to get." She flipped through more pages, pausing at what looked like insurance documents. "But here's where it gets interesting. Mike made some assumptions about what you know and what you'd be willing to fight for. He's left himself exposed in several areas, probably because he assumed you'd take whatever settlement he offered rather than drag things out." The wine was helping to steady my nerves, or maybe it was Lauren's confidence that there was a path forward through this mess. "What kind of exposed?" "Well, for starters, he's been using joint credit cards to fund his relationship with Ashley. Hotels, restaurants, even what looks like medical expenses for her pregnancy. That's marital assets being used for adultery, which Colorado courts don't love. He's also transferred money to accounts without your signature, which could constitute financial fraud depending on how we frame it." Lauren reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder of her own. "More importantly, I did a little research while driving over here. Thompson and Kim Realty has been doing very well lately, particularly in the Denver market. If Mike's planning to relocate the business or expand there, that represents a significant increase in business value that you're entitled to a portion of as his spouse." I felt the first stirring of something that wasn't despair or shock. Lauren was right. Mike had made assumptions about my willingness to fight, had counted on my tendency to avoid conflict to let him walk away with minimal consequences. He'd forgotten that the same strategic thinking I used to land difficult clients could be applied to protecting my own interests. "What do we do first?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Lauren smiled, and there was something predatory in her expression that reminded me why she was so successful in family court. "First, we document everything. Every transfer, every charge, every lie he's told. Then we start freezing assets before he can move more money around. And Jessica, we're going to make this very expensive for him." Over the next several hours, Lauren walked me through the immediate steps I needed to take. Change passwords on all accounts, freeze joint credit cards, document the condition of the house and what had been removed. Most importantly, she explained, I needed to start building a paper trail that showed the deliberate nature of Mike's deception. The affair itself isn't necessarily grounds for a bigger settlement in Colorado, Lauren explained as she packed up her materials. But the financial fraud, the deliberate manipulation of marital assets, the way he's tried to stick you with debt while protecting his own interests, that's actionable. Judges don't like spouses who try to game the system. After she left, I spent the rest of the evening following her instructions with methodical precision. I photographed every room, documenting what remained and what was missing. I printed bank statements going back 2 years, highlighting transfers and charges I hadn't authorized. I made lists of shared property, joint investments, even wedding, gifts that had disappeared along with Mike's belongings. The work was oddly therapeutic, channeling my devastation into productive action. Each document I organized, each discrepancy I discovered, felt like reclaiming a small piece of control in a situation that had left me feeling powerless. Mike had spent months planning his escape, but I was finally beginning to plan my response. It was past midnight when I finally stopped, the dining room table covered with neat stacks of evidence that painted a damning picture of my husband's betrayal. But I wasn't tired. If anything, I felt more awake than I had in months, energized by the clarity of purpose that Lauren had helped me find. I poured another glass of wine and walked out to the back deck, looking up at the stars that were always so brilliant in the thin mountain air. The house felt different now, not empty but expectant, like it was waiting to see what version of Jessica Martinez would emerge from this wreckage. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and my heart rate spiked until I read the message. It was Ashley, writing from what must have been her personal phone since Mike had always kept strict boundaries between work and personal communications. I wanted you to know that I didn't know he was still married when we started seeing each other. He told me you were separated and just hadn't finalized the divorce yet. I'm not trying to excuse anything, but I thought you should know that I wouldn't have gotten involved if I'd known the truth. I stared at the message for several minutes, processing this new information. It painted Mike's deception in an even uglier light, showing that he'd lied not just to me, but to Ashley as, well, she'd been as much a victim of his manipulation as I had, though her pregnancy complicated any sympathy I might feel for her situation. I typed back carefully, choosing my words with the same precision I used in client communications. Thank you for telling me. I hope things work out for you and the baby. It was true, despite everything. Ashley was young and pregnant and about to build a life with a man who'd proven he could lie effortlessly to the people closest to him. When the newness wore off and reality set in, she'd likely discover the same capacity for betrayal that I'd learned about today. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My problem was rebuilding my life from the ashes of Mike's deception, and I was finally beginning to see a path forward. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as I began implementing Lauren's strategy. The first call was to the bank, where I spoke to a manager about freezing joint accounts and removing Mike's access to credit cards he'd been using to fund his double life. The conversation was awkward, requiring explanations about marital separation, that made the whole situation feel more real. Next came the credit card companies, where I discovered additional charges I hadn't seen in the initial documents. Mike had been careful to use cards that sent statements to his office rather than our home, hiding expenses that ranged from obvious romantic gestures to more practical purchases for setting up a new household. Each revelation was a fresh wound, but I found myself growing numb to the emotional impact as I focused on the tactical implications. Every hidden expense was evidence of fraud. Every secret purchase was proof of his systematic deception. Mike had been so confident in his planning that he'd left a trail of evidence that would make Lauren's job significantly easier. By noon, I'd made enough progress to feel like I was regaining some measure of control. The joint accounts were frozen, preventing any further unauthorized transfers. The credit cards were canceled, cutting off Mike's access to funds for his new life in Denver. Most importantly, I'd begun the process of changing passwords and security questions on every shared account, ensuring that Mike couldn't continue to manipulate our finances from a distance. Lauren called to check on my progress, her professional satisfaction evident even over the phone. "You're doing great," she assured me. "Mike's probably getting some unpleasant surprises right about now as his cards start getting declined." "How? Are you holding up emotionally?" It was a fair question. I'd been running on adrenaline and anger for nearly 24 hours, but the practical tasks had kept me from fully processing the emotional devastation of discovering my marriage was a lie. The grief was there, waiting just beneath the surface. But I wasn't ready to face it yet. "I'm focused on the immediate priorities," I told her, which was true, even if it wasn't the complete answer. "What happens next?" Now we start digging deeper. I'm going to file for temporary spousal support and request a forensic accounting of all marital assets. Mike's been moving money around, but financial records leave traces. We're going to find every dollar he's tried to hide and make sure the court knows exactly how he's been manipulating the situation. Lauren's confidence was infectious, and I found myself actually looking forward to the battle ahead. Mike had counted on my shock and heartbreak to give him time to solidify his new life before I could respond effectively. Instead, his betrayal had stripped away any remaining sentimentality about our relationship, leaving me free to fight with the same ruthless efficiency he'd used to destroy our marriage. That afternoon, I called Robert Sterling to explain my situation and request some schedule adjustments. Robert had built his marketing firm on the principle that personal crises inevitably affected professional performance, and he was surprisingly understanding about my need to reduce travel while dealing with the divorce. "Take whatever time you need," he assured me. "The Lake Tahoe contract gives us some breathing room, and frankly, you've been carrying too much of the client load anyway. This might be a good opportunity to redistribute some responsibilities." His support was unexpected but deeply appreciated. I'd been so focused on building financial security through increased travel and bigger contracts that I'd lost sight of work-life balance. Mike's betrayal had forced a reckoning with priorities I'd been avoiding for months. The irony wasn't lost on me that Mike had justified his affair partially by claiming I was never home, while simultaneously pressuring me to take on more lucrative assignments that required extensive travel. He'd created the very conditions he'd later use to rationalize his betrayal, manipulating the situation to make himself the victim of my professional success. But I was beginning to understand that Mike's rationalizations were irrelevant. His justifications were simply stories he'd told himself to make his betrayal easier to live with. The truth was simpler and uglier. He'd wanted something new and had been willing to destroy everything we'd built together to get it. Evening brought a phone call from my sister Rachel, who'd finally gotten my cryptic response to her dinner invitation and was demanding a full explanation. Rachel was 3 years younger, but had always been the more emotionally intelligent of the two of us, with an intuitive understanding of people that had served her well as a high school teacher. "I'm coming over," she announced after I'd given her a basic outline of the situation, "and I'm bringing ice cream and whatever alcohol I can find in my apartment." Rachel arrived an hour later with a bag of supplies and the kind of fierce protective energy that had gotten her in trouble throughout our childhood. She was smaller than me, but had never backed down from a fight, whether it was defending me from playground bullies or confronting our parents about unfair treatment. "I never liked him," she declared as she surveyed the empty spaces in my living room. "There was always something calculating about Mike, like he was constantly running cost-benefit analyses on everyone around him. I just didn't think he'd be stupid enough to blow up a good thing for some office fling." Her bluntness was oddly comforting. I'd been so focused on the practical aspects of Mike's betrayal that I hadn't had time to process the emotional reality of losing not just a husband but the future we'd planned together. Rachel's presence reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were people in my life who valued me for more than what I could provide or achieve. We spent the evening going through old photo albums, and I was struck by how many pictures showed me alone at family gatherings and social events. Mike had been physically present, but emotionally distant for longer than I'd realized, always checking his phone or finding reasons to step away from group activities. The signs had been there, but I'd been too busy building our financial future to notice the deterioration of our emotional connection. "You know what this means, don't you?" Rachel said as we finished the second bottle of wine. "You get to figure out who you are when you're not constantly trying to make Mike happy. When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because it was good for your career or good for your marriage?" The question hit me harder than I'd expected. I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision based purely on my own desires, rather than what was practical or responsible or beneficial for our shared future. I'd been so focused on being a good wife and successful professional that I'd lost track of what I actually enjoyed or wanted for myself. "I don't know," I admitted, and the honesty felt both liberating and terrifying. "Well," Rachel said, raising her wine glass in a mock toast, "I guess you're about to find out." After Rachel left, I found myself wandering through the house again, but this time with different eyes. Instead of seeing empty spaces where Mike's belongings used to be, I began to see possibilities. The office could become an art studio, something I'd always wanted but never had space for. The living room could be rearranged to face the windows, instead of the television, taking advantage of the mountain views I'd always loved. For the first time since discovering Mike's betrayal, I felt something other than anger or grief. It was small and fragile, but unmistakably real. Excitement about the possibility of building a life that was entirely my own. My phone rang just as I was getting ready for bed, Lauren's name appearing on the screen. "Sorry to call so late," she said, "but I wanted to update you on something interesting I discovered today." I settled onto the couch, wine making me more relaxed than I'd been in days. Good interesting or bad interesting? Potentially very good. I did some digging into Thompson and Kim Realty's recent transactions, and it looks like they've been preparing for a major expansion into the Denver market. New office lease, additional staff, significant investments in marketing and technology. The business valuation has increased substantially over the past year. Lauren paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Here's the thing, Jessica. Mike's been representing this move to Denver as a fresh start, maybe even a step down financially to accommodate his new family responsibilities. But the numbers tell a different story. This expansion represents a significant increase in business value, and as his spouse, you're entitled to a portion of that growth." The implications began to sink in. Mike hadn't just been planning to escape our marriage. He'd been positioning himself for significant financial gain while simultaneously trying to minimize his obligations to me. The Denver move wasn't a sacrifice for love. It was a calculated business decision that he'd disguised as romantic gesture. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Hard to say without a full forensic accounting, but based on the investments they've made and the market they're entering, we could be looking at a business worth significantly more than when you were married. If we can prove that marital assets were used to fund this growth, your settlement could be much larger than Mike anticipated." I felt that cold clarity settling over me again, the same focused determination that had helped me land difficult clients and build my career. Mike had made another crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed I wouldn't investigate, wouldn't fight, wouldn't discover the true scope of what he was trying to take from me. "What do we need to do?" I asked. "I'm filing a motion for discovery tomorrow morning. We're going to demand full financial records for the business, including all investments and expansion plans. Mike's going to have to choose between hiding assets and committing perjury, neither of which are good options for him." After hanging up, I walked out to the deck again, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than they had the night before. Mike had thought he was so clever, had planned his escape so carefully that he'd forgotten one crucial detail. He'd married a woman who specialized in turning impossible situations into victories, who'd built her career on finding advantages where others saw only obstacles. He was about to discover that underestimating Jessica Martinez was the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The grief was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. Instead, I felt the same focused energy I brought to challenging client campaigns, the satisfaction of having a clear objective and the tools to achieve it. I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd discovered Ashley just 2 days ago, but the space no longer felt contaminated by their presence. It was my kitchen now, in my house, where I was building my new life. Mike had thought he was taking everything that mattered, but he'd actually given me something invaluable, the freedom to stop trying to make him happy and start figuring out what made me happy instead. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Denver number, and I felt my pulse spike until I read the message. It was Mike, writing from what must have been a new phone since I'd blocked his original number. "Jess, I know you're angry, but I hope we can handle this divorce civilly. I don't want either of us to get hurt financially by a long legal battle. Can we talk about a fair settlement that works for both of us?" I stared at the message, noting the careful phrasing designed to make him sound reasonable while subtly threatening financial consequences if I didn't cooperate. It was classic Mike, manipulation disguised as concern, an attempt to control the narrative before I could gain too much ground. I showed the text to Lauren when she called to update me on the discovery motion, and her laugh was sharp with professional amusement. "He's scared," she said with satisfaction. "The accounts being frozen yesterday probably caused some immediate problems, and he's realizing that his careful planning didn't account for an aggressive response. This message is him trying to regain control of the situation." What should I say? Nothing. Let him wonder. Right now, silence is more powerful than any response you could give him. He's expecting you to either collapse in grief or lash out in anger. By doing neither, you're keeping him off balance and forcing him to make decisions without knowing what you're planning. Lauren's strategy made perfect sense. Mike had counted on predictable responses to his betrayal, had probably rehearsed conversations where I either begged him to stay or angrily accepted whatever settlement he offered. By refusing to play either role, I was disrupting his script and forcing him to navigate uncharted territory. "Besides," Lauren continued, "we'll have plenty to talk about once I get those business records. I have a feeling Mike's definition of fair settlement is going to change significantly once he realizes how much evidence we're gathering." As I hung up the phone, I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth for the first time since this nightmare began. Mike had taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between love and strategy, between trust and verification. Now I was going to teach him a lesson of my own about the cost of underestimating the woman he'd chosen to betray. The discovery motion Lauren filed created ripples through Riverside's small legal community faster than I'd anticipated. By Thursday morning, 3 different people had texted me about seeing Mike's business partner David Kim at the courthouse, looking visibly agitated. Small towns thrived on gossip, and a high-conflict divorce involving one of the area's most successful real estate agents was exactly the kind of drama that traveled quickly through coffee shops and grocery store lines. I was reorganizing my home office when Mrs. Hayes knocked on my door, carrying a plate of her famous oatmeal cookies, and wearing the expression of someone bursting with information she was dying to share. Eleanor Hayes had lived next door for 15 years and had appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator, which meant she knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by, dear," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she planned to stay a while. "I wanted to make sure you were doing all right after all the commotion the other day." Mrs. Hayes had the gift of making statements that sounded like casual concern, but were actually fishing expeditions for information. I'd learned over the years that the best approach was to give her just enough detail to satisfy her curiosity without revealing anything I wanted to keep. Private. I'm managing, I told her, accepting the cookies with genuine gratitude. It's been a difficult transition, but I'm getting through it. She nodded sympathetically, then leaned forward with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share important intelligence. You know, I've been thinking about some things I witnessed over the past few months that didn't make sense at the time. That young woman who was here the other day, I'd seen her before. My attention sharpened despite my attempt to appear casually. Interested. Oh? Several times, actually. Always when your car wasn't in the driveway, always staying for hours. I assumed she was a work colleague or client, but the way she moved around the house, using her own key, bringing in groceries like she belonged there. Mrs. Hayes shook her head disapprovingly. I should have said something, but I didn't want to intrude on what I thought was your business. The information hit me harder than I'd expected. Mike hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been openly living a double life in our own home while I was traveling for work. Ashley had been using our kitchen, sleeping in our bed, probably answering our phone when clients called looking for Mike. The violation felt even more complete knowing that neighbors had witnessed this elaborate deception without realizing what they were seeing. There's more, Mrs. Hayes continued, reading my expression accurately. Last month, when you were away on that long trip to Arizona, I saw them loading boxes into his truck. Not moving boxes, but storage containers, like they were taking things somewhere for safekeeping. At the time, I thought maybe Mike was finally cleaning out that garage. But now? Now it was clear that Mike had been systematically removing valuables from our house, probably storing them at Ashley's place or in a rental unit where I wouldn't discover them missing until after he'd left. The premeditation was staggering, each detail revealing a deeper level of calculated betrayal than I'd previously understood. Mrs. Hayes patted my hand gently, her expression softening from gossip, hungry neighbor to genuinely concerned friend. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the truth about what was happening in your own home. And because if you need someone to testify about what I witnessed, well, I've always believed in standing up for what's right. Her offer was unexpected and deeply touching. Mrs. Hayes might have been motivated partially by her love of neighborhood drama, but her willingness to get involved in legal proceedings showed real loyalty and courage. In a divorce battle, eyewitness testimony about Mike's deception could be invaluable. Thank you, I said, meaning it more than she probably realized. I'll let my attorney know that you're willing to share what you observed. After she left, I called Lauren immediately to relay the new information. Her excitement was palpable even over the phone as she absorbed the implications of having a neutral witness who could testify to Mike's systematic deception. This is huge, Jessica. Eyewitness testimony about him removing property while you were traveling, about Ashley having access to your home, about the affair being conducted in the marital residence. This supports everything we've been arguing about his deliberate fraud and manipulation. Lauren paused, and I could hear her typing notes. I'm going to interview Mrs. Hayes formally and get a written statement. If Mike tries to claim this was a sudden decision or that the affair was brief and meaningless, we'll have evidence showing months of deliberate deception and planning. The momentum was building in ways I hadn't anticipated. What had started as a devastating personal betrayal was evolving into a clear legal case with witnesses, evidence, and documentation that painted a damning picture of Mike's behavior. Each new revelation strengthened my position and weakened his, shifting the power dynamic in my favor. That afternoon brought another surprise in the form of a phone call from Carmen Rodriguez, Ashley's mother. I recognized the name from the caller ID but couldn't imagine why she would be contacting me directly. Mrs. Thompson? Her voice was heavily accented and formal, the tone of someone making a difficult but necessary call. Actually, it's Martinez, I corrected gently. I kept my maiden name. How can I help you? There was a long pause before Carmen continued, her words chosen carefully. I wanted to speak with you about my daughter Ashley. She told me what happened, about your husband and the baby, and I wanted you to know that this is not how I raised her. I settled into my desk chair, uncertain where this conversation was heading, but intrigued by the obvious distress in Carmen's voice. Ashley is a good girl, but she is young, and she believed lies that man told her, Carmen continued. He said you were already divorced, that you had been separated for over a year. She would never have gotten involved with a married man if she knew the truth. The confirmation of Ashley's innocence was oddly comforting, though it made Mike's deception even more cruel. He hadn't just betrayed his wife. He'd manipulated a young woman into a relationship based on lies, trapping her with a pregnancy that would tie her to him permanently. I appreciate you telling me that, I said honestly. I hope Ashley and the baby will be okay. That's why I'm calling, Carmen said, her voice growing stronger. Ashley is scared. This man, he is not who she thought he was. The lies he told her, the way he talks about you with such coldness. She is beginning to see what kind of person he really is. My pulse quickened as I absorbed the implications of what Carmen was saying. If Ashley was having second thoughts about Mike, if she was beginning to understand the scope of his manipulations, she might be willing to share information that could be crucial in the divorce proceedings. She knows things, Carmen continued, confirming my suspicions. About his business, about money he has been hiding, about plans he made before he left you. Ashley, she is not stupid. She pays attention. And now she is worried about what will happen to her and the baby if this man can lie so easily about such important things. The irony was perfect. Mike's pattern of deception was undermining his relationship with Ashley just as it had destroyed our marriage. The same charm and manipulation that had drawn her in was now making her question everything he'd told her about his past and his plans for their future. If Ashley wants to talk, I said carefully, my attorney would be very interested in hearing what she has to say. I will tell her, Carmen promised. She wants to do the right thing, for the baby, if nothing else. A child deserves a father who tells the truth. After Carmen hung up, I sat in my office staring out at the mountains, marveling at how quickly the situation was evolving. Mike had thought his careful planning would protect him from consequences, but his own dishonesty was creating cracks. In every relationship he'd tried to control. Ashley's growing suspicions could provide insight into his hidden assets and future plans that I never would have discovered on my own. The next morning brought Lauren to my door with a thick manila folder and an expression of barely contained excitement. She'd received the preliminary response to her discovery motion, and Mike's financial records were revealing exactly the kind of discrepancies she'd hoped to find. Look at this, she said, spreading bank statements across my dining room table. These are transfers from Thompson and Kim Realty's business account to a personal account in Mike's name only. $50,000 over the past 6 months, all while he was claiming to you that business was slow and money was tight. I studied the numbers, feeling that familiar cold anger settle in my chest. During the same period when Mike had been pressuring me to take on more travel assignments to increase our household income, he'd been siphoning money from the business into accounts I'd never known existed. It gets better, Lauren continued, pulling out more documents. These are incorporation papers for a new LLC registered in Denver 3 months ago. Guess who the sole owner is? Mike had been setting up a completely separate business entity, while still married to me, using what appeared to be marital assets to fund a venture I had no legal claim to. The sophistication of his planning was breathtaking, but so was the evidence trail he'd left behind. Lauren spread out more papers, each one revealing another layer of Mike's financial manipulation. Property records show he put a deposit on a condo in Denver 4 months ago, paid for with a cashier's check drawn on one of your joint accounts. Phone records show he's been in contact with business attorneys in Denver for over 6 months, long before he ever mentioned the affair or asked for a divorce. The timeline painted a picture of a man who'd been planning his exit strategy almost from the moment he'd started his affair with Ashley. Every conversation we'd had about our future, every decision we'd made about finances and career moves had been tainted by his secret preparations for a life that didn't include me. "How much are we talking about in total?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. Lauren consulted her notes, her expression grim. "Hard to say exactly without the forensic accounting, but conservatively, he's hidden or transferred at least $200,000 in marital assets over the past year. Money that should have been disclosed and divided equitably in any divorce settlement. $200,000. The number was staggering, representing years of my income that Mike had systematically stolen while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage. No wonder he'd been so confident about his financial future with Ashley. He'd been building it with money that was legally half mine. "Can we get it back?" I asked. "Most of it, yes. The transfers were recent enough and obvious enough that we can trace them easily. Mike's going to have a very hard time explaining why he moved marital assets into accounts his wife couldn't access, especially when he was simultaneously claiming they needed more income." Lauren began packing up the documents, but her expression remained thoughtful. "There's something else, Jessica. These records show a pattern of behavior that goes beyond simple adultery. This is systematic financial fraud, the kind of deliberate deception that judges remember when they're deciding spousal support and property division." The implications were clear. Mike's attempt to cheat me out of my fair share of our marital assets was likely to backfire spectacularly when presented to a court. His greed and overconfidence had created exactly the kind of evidence that would ensure I received not just what I was legally entitled to, but potentially punitive damages for his fraudulent behavior. My phone rang as Lauren was leaving. Mike's Denver number appearing on the screen for the second time this week. This time, instead of a carefully crafted text, he was calling directly, probably realizing that his situation was deteriorating rapidly. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with Lauren still in the room. Mike's voice was tighter than usual, stress bleeding through his attempt to sound reasonable and conciliatory. "Jess, we need to talk about this discovery motion your lawyer filed. Some of these requests are going to be expensive and time-consuming to fulfill, and I don't think that's good for either of us. Can you call me back so we can discuss a settlement that doesn't involve dragging this through the courts for months?" Lauren rolled her eyes at the obvious manipulation. "He's panicking. That message is basically an admission that he has something to hide and doesn't want us looking too closely at his finances." "Should I call him back?" I asked. "Not yet. Let him sweat for a few more days while we build our case. When we do respond, it'll be from a position of strength with all the evidence we need to make him very uncomfortable." That evening, I received an unexpected visitor in the form of David Kim, Mike's business partner, who appeared at my door looking haggard and defensive. David had always struck me as opportunistic but basically harmless, the kind of person who would cut corners for profit but wouldn't initiate serious wrongdoing on his own. "Jessica," he said, declining my offer to come inside. "I wanted to talk to you about this legal situation with Mike. Some of the financial records your attorney is requesting could be damaging to the business, and I'm hoping we can find a way to resolve this without destroying everything we've built." David's concern was obviously for his own financial exposure rather than any loyalty to Mike, but his presence at my door suggested that the discovery motion was creating exactly the kind of pressure Lauren had hoped for. "I'm not trying to damage anyone's business," I told him honestly. "I just want what I'm legally entitled to from my marriage." David shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if worried about being seen at my house. "The thing is, Mike used some business funds for personal expenses over the past year, funds that technically belong to both of us as partners. If this comes out in court, it could create problems for me too, even though I wasn't involved in his personal decisions." The admission was revealing. David was essentially confirming that Mike had been using business assets inappropriately, but he was more worried about his own liability than about the ethics of what his partner had done. It was exactly the kind of self-serving response I'd expected from him. "Maybe you should talk to your own attorney about that," I suggested. "And maybe you should think about whether you want to continue being in business with someone who steals from his own company." David's face flushed, but he didn't deny the characterization. "Look, Jessica, I know Mike screwed up, but if this thing gets ugly, it's going to hurt a lot of people who weren't involved in his personal problems. Can't we find a way to settle this quietly?" His plea was almost pathetic, but it confirmed what Lauren had suspected about Mike's business dealings. If David was this worried about exposure, there were probably additional financial irregularities that hadn't been discovered yet. Mike's pattern of deception extended beyond his marriage into his professional relationships as well. "That's really between Mike and my attorney," I said, stepping back toward my door. "I'm just focused on getting my life back together." After David left, I called Lauren to report the conversation. Her laughter was sharp with professional satisfaction as she absorbed the implications of David's visit. "He basically just confirmed that Mike has been embezzling from his own business," she said. "David's scared because he's probably liable as a partner for any financial misconduct, even if he wasn't directly involved. This is getting better and better." "What does it mean for my case?" "It means Mike's problems are multiplying faster than he can control them. He's got you pursuing marital assets, his business partner worried about liability, and probably Ashley asking uncomfortable questions about his financial stability. The pressure is building from multiple directions." Lauren paused, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Mike thought he was so clever, planning this elaborate escape strategy, but he made the classic mistake of overconfident criminals. He assumed everyone else was too stupid or too trusting to figure out what he was doing. The next day brought news that confirmed Lauren's assessment of Mike's deteriorating position. Carmen Rodriguez called again, this time with information that Ashley had decided to share about Mike's hidden assets and plans. "My daughter, she has been keeping records," Carmen said. "Not because she suspected anything, but because she is responsible with money, and she wanted to understand his financial situation before the baby comes." Carmen explained that Ashley had been tracking Mike's expenses and income, trying to plan for their future together. In the process, she'd discovered bank statements and business documents that revealed the scope of his financial manipulation. "She has copies of papers he left at her apartment," Carmen continued. "Bank statements, business plans, even emails between him and lawyers in Denver. Ashley, she thought she was helping him organize for their new life together, but now she understands these documents show he was stealing from you." The irony was perfect. Mike's attempt to involve Ashley in his financial planning had created another witness to his fraud, someone with access to documents and information that I never would have discovered on my own. His own deception was providing the evidence needed to expose him completely. "Ashley wants to meet with your lawyer," Carmen said. "She is scared about what will happen to her and the baby if Mike is the kind of man who can steal from his wife, but she knows the right thing to do." I agreed to set up a meeting through Lauren, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and sympathy for Ashley. She was young and pregnant and beginning to understand that the man she'd fallen in love with was not who he'd pretended to be. Her willingness to come forward with evidence showed both courage and integrity that Mike had clearly underestimated. As I hung up the phone, I reflected on how completely the situation had shifted in just 1 week. Mike had thought his careful planning would ensure a clean escape with minimal consequences. Instead, his own dishonesty was creating a coalition of people who had reason to expose his deceptions. Mrs. Hayes with her eyewitness testimony, David Kim worried about business liability, and now Ashley with documentary evidence of his hidden assets. Mike had taught me that trust without verification was simply naivety. Now I was about to teach him that underestimating the intelligence and determination of the people you betray was a mistake with very expensive consequences. The meeting with Ashley took place at Lauren's office on a gray Tuesday morning. Rain, streaking the windows and casting everything in muted tones that somehow felt appropriate for the gravity of what we were about to discuss. Ashley arrived with her mother, looking younger than her 26 years and visibly nervous about the formal legal setting. She wore a simple blue dress that accommodated her growing belly, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look more like a college student than a woman about to become a mother. The manila folder clutched in her hands contained what Lauren hoped would be the final pieces of evidence needed to prove Mike's systematic financial fraud. Lauren began with gentle questions designed to put Ashley at ease, establishing her relationship with Mike and the timeline of their involvement. As Ashley spoke, her voice growing steadier with each response, a picture emerged of a young woman who'd been carefully manipulated by someone far more experienced in deception. "He told me his marriage had been over for years," Ashley explained, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "He said you lived separate lives, that you were only staying married for financial convenience until the divorce could be finalized. He made it sound like he was the victim of a loveless marriage to someone who cared more about work than family." The cruelty of Mike's lies was breathtaking. He'd painted me as a cold, career-obsessed wife, while simultaneously pressuring me to take on more demanding assignments to fund the very lifestyle he was using to attract another woman. Every sacrifice I'd made for our financial security had been reframed as evidence of my inadequacy as a partner. "When did you start to suspect that wasn't true?" Lauren asked, her tone carefully neutral. Ashley glanced at her mother before answering, drawing strength from Carmen's encouraging nod. "About 3 weeks ago, when I started asking more specific questions about the divorce timeline. His answers kept changing, and when I asked to see paperwork, he always had excuses for why he didn't have it with him." She reached into her folder and withdrew a stack of papers, her hands trembling slightly as she set them on Lauren's desk. "I started paying more attention to documents he left at my apartment, especially after I got pregnant and wanted to understand our financial situation better." Lauren examined the papers with growing excitement, her professional composure barely containing her satisfaction at what Ashley had provided. Bank statements showing transfers from joint accounts I'd never seen. Business correspondence discussing the Denver expansion that had been funded with money Mike had claimed was needed for household expenses. Most damaging of all, emails between Mike and the family law attorney in Denver discussing strategies for minimizing spousal support obligations. "This email is dated 4 months ago," Lauren noted, holding up a particularly revealing document. "It shows Mike was consulting with a divorce attorney long before he told Jessica he wanted to end the marriage. The attorney specifically advises him to begin transferring assets to protect them from property division." Ashley's face crumpled as she absorbed the implications of what Lauren was saying. He was planning to leave her all along, wasn't he? Even when he was telling me he was already separated, he was still living with her and planning how to cheat her out of money. The truth was hitting Ashley as hard as it had hit me. The realization that she'd been as much a victim of Mike's manipulations as I had. The difference was that her pregnancy tied her to him in ways that couldn't be easily undone, regardless of what she now understood about his character. Carmen reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand, her voice gentle, but firm. "You were not responsible for his lies, mija, but now you can help make sure he faces consequences for what he has done." Lauren spent the next hour walking Ashley through each document, establishing dates and context for Mike's financial maneuvering. The evidence Ashley had unknowingly gathered painted a devastating picture of premeditated fraud that went far beyond simple adultery. Most revealing were text messages between Mike and his Denver attorney discussing specific strategies for hiding assets and minimizing financial exposure in the divorce. The messages showed Mike had been researching Colorado divorce law for months, carefully planning how to exploit legal loopholes while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud," Lauren explained as she reviewed the communications. "These messages show deliberate intent to deprive Jessica of marital assets through deception and concealment, This isn't just about dividing property anymore. This is about recovering stolen money and potentially pursuing criminal charges. The possibility of criminal charges hadn't occurred to me, but Lauren's assessment made sense. Mike hadn't just ended our marriage dishonestly. He'd systematically stolen money that legally belonged to both of us. The sophistication of his planning and the amounts involved elevated his actions beyond civil matters into potential felony territory. After Ashley and Carmen left, Lauren and I spent the afternoon strategizing how to use the new evidence most effectively. The documents Ashley had provided completed the picture of Mike's deception, giving us proof of intent that transformed his actions from questionable behavior into clear criminal activity. "We have him dead to rights," Lauren said with satisfaction. "The question now is whether we want to pursue maximum damages through the civil courts or whether we want to involve law enforcement as well." The decision felt momentous. Civil litigation would recover my financial losses and ensure I received appropriate spousal support, but criminal charges would have consequences that extended far beyond money. Mike's real estate license could be revoked, his business partnerships destroyed, his reputation permanently damaged in ways that would affect his ability to support Ashley and their child. "What do you recommend?" I asked. Lauren leaned back in her chair, weighing the options carefully. "Honestly, I think we start with the civil case and use the threat of criminal charges as leverage. Mike's smart enough to understand that fraud charges could destroy his career entirely. The possibility of prosecution might encourage him to settle more generously than he would otherwise." The strategy made sense. My goal wasn't revenge, despite the temptation, but justice and financial security. If the threat of criminal prosecution could achieve those objectives without actually destroying Mike's ability to support his child, that seemed like the most ethical approach. That evening brought a phone call from David Kim, his voice tight with barely controlled panic as he requested an urgent meeting. The pressure from the discovery motion was clearly taking its toll on Mike's business partnership, creating exactly the kind of leverage Lauren had hoped to generate. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown where David's agitation was immediately apparent. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his hands shaking slightly as he stirred sugar into his coffee. "Jessica, we need to resolve this situation before it destroys everyone involved," David began without preamble. "The forensic accounting your attorney ordered is going to reveal some very uncomfortable truths about how Mike has been managing business finances." His admission was more direct than I'd expected, suggesting that Mike's financial improprieties were even more extensive than we'd discovered. David's willingness to discuss them openly indicated he was more worried about his own liability than about protecting his partner. "What kind of uncomfortable truths?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David glanced around the coffee shop nervously before leaning forward to speak in lower tones. "Mike has been treating the business accounts like his personal bank for over a year. Client deposits held in escrow, commission payments that should have been distributed to agents, even funds set aside for quarterly tax payments. He's been moving money around to cover his personal expenses and fund his relationship with that girl." The scope of Mike's theft was staggering. He hadn't just stolen from me, he'd been embezzling from his own business, potentially violating fiduciary duties to clients and creating criminal liability that extended far beyond our marriage. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. David's face was pale as he provided the answer. "Conservative estimate? Close to $500,000 over the past 18 months. Mike's been very careful about covering his tracks, but a forensic audit will find it all." $500,000. The number was overwhelming, representing a level of criminal activity that would almost certainly result in serious legal consequences, regardless of how we chose to proceed. Mike had apparently used our marriage as a cover for a much more extensive criminal enterprise. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I suspected David's motivations were entirely self-serving. "Because I'm trying to save my business and my reputation," David admitted. If this comes out in court, every client we've worked with will question whether their money was handled properly. The state licensing board will investigate, probably revoke both our licenses. I'll lose everything because of Mike's greed and stupidity. David's panic was understandable but irrelevant to my situation. He'd chosen to go into business with Mike, presumably conducting some level of due diligence before entering into a partnership. If he'd failed to notice or prevent Mike's embezzlement, that was a consequence of his own poor judgment. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Help me convince your attorney to structure the settlement in a way that doesn't require exposing all the business irregularities," David pleaded. "Mike's got enough personal assets to pay you what you're owed without destroying the company. We can make you whole without ruining innocent people who trusted us with their money." His request was essentially asking me to help cover up Mike's crimes in exchange for financial compensation. While I understood David's position, I wasn't willing to participate in concealing criminal activity, especially when it involved client funds that should have been protected. "I'll discuss it with my attorney," I said noncommittally. "But my priority is getting what I'm legally entitled to, not protecting Mike from the consequences of his choices." David left the coffee shop looking even more defeated than when he'd arrived, clearly understanding that I wasn't going to help him contain the damage from Mike's criminal behavior. His desperation suggested that the full scope of Mike's theft was only beginning to emerge. I called Lauren immediately to report the conversation, and her excitement was palpable as she absorbed the implications of David's revelations. "This changes everything," she said. "If Mike's been embezzling client funds, we're not just talking about marital property division anymore. This is serious criminal activity that could result in federal charges, especially if any of the stolen money crossed state lines." Lauren paused, and I could hear her typing notes as she spoke. "David's panic is actually helpful for us. If he's willing to testify about Mike's embezzlement in exchange for immunity or reduced charges, that gives us even more leverage in the civil case." The momentum was building in ways I hadn't anticipated. What had started as a devastating personal betrayal was evolving into a major criminal investigation with potential federal implications. Mike's overconfidence and greed had created a house of cards that was collapsing faster than he could control. My phone rang as I was processing this new information, Mike's Denver number appearing on the screen. This time, instead of letting it go to voicemail, I decided to answer and hear what he had to say, now that his situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Jess," his voice was strained, lacking the confident tone he'd maintained throughout our marriage. "We need to talk. This legal battle is getting out of hand, and I think we can settle this amicably if we just communicate directly." The irony of Mike appealing for direct communication after months of elaborate deception wasn't lost on me. He was clearly feeling the pressure from multiple directions and hoping to regain some control over a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. "I don't think we have anything to discuss," I said calmly. "My attorney is handling everything through proper legal channels." "Jessica, please." Mike's voice took on a pleading tone I'd never heard before. "I know I hurt you, and I know I made mistakes, but this discovery process is going to destroy innocent people. David had nothing to do with our personal problems, and Ashley certainly didn't know about any financial issues." His attempt to frame himself as protecting others was transparently manipulative, but it also revealed how much pressure he was feeling from the various fronts of investigation that Lauren had opened. Mike was discovering that his careful planning hadn't accounted for the possibility of aggressive legal response backed by solid evidence. "Maybe you should have thought about innocent people before you started stealing money," I replied, surprised by the steel in my own voice. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Mike's audible breathing as he processed my direct accusation. When he finally spoke again, his voice had hardened into something I barely recognized. "You have no idea what you're doing, Jessica. This isn't just about us anymore. If you push this too far, a lot of people are going to get hurt, including you. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Mike's first direct attempt to intimidate me into backing down. But instead of fear, I felt only cold clarity about who I was dealing with. The man I'd been married to for 7 years had just threatened me rather than take responsibility for his own criminal behavior. "Is that a threat, Mike?" I asked, making sure my tone was clear enough for him to understand that I wasn't going to be intimidated. "It's a reality," he said. "Sometimes the cost of being right is higher than the cost of being reasonable." The call ended with Mike hanging up abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone and marveling at how completely he'd revealed his true character. The mask of reasonable concern had slipped entirely, replaced by the calculating cruelty of someone who viewed relationships as transactions and people as obstacles to be manipulated or removed. I immediately called Lauren to report the conversation, and her response was immediate and professional. "That was probably the stupidest thing Mike could have done," she said with satisfaction. "Threatening you during an active legal proceeding is going to look very bad in court, especially when we can demonstrate a pattern of financial manipulation and deception." Lauren paused, and I could hear her making notes. "I want you to document that conversation immediately while it's fresh in your memory. Time, date, exact words, tone of voice, everything. If Mike thinks he can intimidate you into accepting an unfavorable settlement, he's about to learn how wrong he is." The threat had actually strengthened my resolve, rather than weakening it. Mike had shown me exactly what kind of person I'd been married to, someone capable of criminal behavior and willing to use intimidation when his manipulations failed. Whatever sympathy I might have felt for his situation evaporated completely. Over the following days, the investigation expanded in scope as Lauren coordinated with law enforcement agencies interested in Mike's potential embezzlement of client funds. The Colorado Real Estate Commission opened their own investigation based on the evidence we'd provided, and the FBI expressed interest in the interstate aspects of Mike's financial crimes. Ashley called twice during this period, her distress obvious as she began to understand the full scope of what Mike had been involved in. The realization that she was having a child with someone facing potential federal charges was devastating for a young woman who'd thought she was building a stable future. "I don't know what to do," she admitted during our second conversation. "My mother says I should come back to Denver to be near family, but Mike keeps insisting everything will blow over and we can still build the life we planned." I felt genuine sympathy for Ashley's situation. She was collateral damage in Mike's criminal enterprise, facing single motherhood with a man whose ability to provide support was increasingly uncertain. Her youth and pregnancy made her particularly vulnerable to his continued manipulations. "You should do whatever feels safest for you and the baby," I told her honestly. "Don't let Mike pressure you into staying in a situation that makes you uncomfortable." The conversation reminded me that Mike's actions had consequences that extended far beyond our failed marriage. Ashley, David, their clients, even Mrs. Hayes, who'd witnessed his deceptions, everyone had been affected by his choices in ways that couldn't be easily repaired. But my responsibility was to myself and my own recovery from his betrayal. Mike had taught me harsh lessons about trust and verification, about the difference between love and manipulation. Now I was applying those lessons to rebuild my life, on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by someone else's lies. The formal settlement conference was scheduled for the following week, where Mike would finally have to face the full scope of evidence we'd gathered and decide whether to negotiate reasonably or face the consequences of criminal prosecution. After weeks of pressure from multiple investigations, he was running out of options and running out of time. Lauren was confident that we'd built an overwhelming case, but she warned me that desperate people sometimes made unpredictable choices. Mike's threat suggested he wasn't planning to accept responsibility gracefully, which meant the final confrontation could be even more dramatic than anything that had come before. I felt ready for whatever came next. The woman who'd discovered her husband's betrayal had been transformed by the experience into someone who understood her own strength, and wouldn't be manipulated or intimidated into accepting less than she deserved. Mike had underestimated me once, and that mistake was about to cost him everything he'd tried to steal. The settlement conference took place in a sterile conference room at the courthouse, fluorescent lights humming overhead and casting everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. Mike arrived with his Denver attorney, a sharp-featured woman who looked like she'd delivered bad news professionally for decades. He wore his best suit, the charcoal gray one I'd helped him pick out for important client meetings, but it hung differently on him now, like a costume that no longer fit the person wearing it. When our eyes met across the polished conference table, I saw a stranger. The confident real estate agent who'd charmed clients and convinced me he was building our future together had been replaced by someone hollow-eyed and defensive. The weeks of mounting legal pressure had taken their toll, and Mike looked like a man who'd finally realized his elaborate plans were crumbling beyond repair. Lauren had prepared me for this moment, explaining that settlement conferences often brought out desperate behavior in people facing serious consequences. Mike's threats during our phone conversation suggested he might try intimidation or manipulation one final time before accepting the reality of his situation. The mediator, Judge Patricia Williams, was a retired family court judge with a reputation for cutting through legal theatrics to reach practical solutions. She began by outlining the scope of the financial evidence that had been gathered, her tone neutral but the implications devastating for Mike's position. "We have documented transfers of approximately $400,000 in marital assets to accounts controlled solely by Mr. Thompson," Judge Williams stated, consulting her notes. "We also have evidence of systematic concealment of business, income, and the use of joint credit facilities to fund extramarital relationships without spousal knowledge or consent." Mike's attorney leaned forward, clearly trying to minimize the damage. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges some financial irregularities, these amounts represent normal business operations and personal expenses that any married person might incur without detailed consultation with their spouse." The attempted justification was so absurd that Judge Williams actually raised an eyebrow. Lauren had prepared for exactly this kind of deflection, and her response was swift and devastating. "Your Honor, the evidence shows systematic fraud spanning over 18 months, Lauren countered, distributing copies of the most damning documents. "These aren't normal personal expenses. These are deliberate transfers designed to hide assets from property division, funded in part by embezzled client funds." The mention of client funds made Mike's attorney visibly uncomfortable. The criminal implications of embezzlement went far beyond civil divorce proceedings, and she clearly understood that her client's exposure extended well beyond spousal support obligations. Judge Williams reviewed the evidence methodically, her expression growing increasingly stern as she absorbed the scope of Mike's deception. When she finally looked up, her gaze fixed on Mike with the kind of judicial displeasure that had probably terrified defendants for decades. "Mr. Thompson, the evidence presented here suggests criminal activity that extends far beyond marital misconduct. Before we discuss settlement terms, I need to understand whether you're prepared to make full financial disclosure and accept responsibility for these actions." Mike shifted in his chair, glancing at his attorney before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the charm that had once convinced me he was trustworthy. "Your Honor, I've made mistakes in my personal life, but I've never intentionally defrauded anyone. The business transactions in question were legitimate expenses related to expanding our operations in Denver." His continued denial was breathtaking in its audacity. Even faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of criminal prosecution, Mike was still trying to manipulate the narrative, still believing he could charm his way out of consequences. Lauren was ready for his denials, producing phone records that showed Mike's conversations with his Denver attorney about hiding assets. "Your Honor, these communications directly contradict Mr. Thompson's claims about legitimate business expenses. His own words show deliberate intent to conceal marital property. The recorded conversations were devastating. Mike's voice clearly discussing strategies for minimizing his financial obligations through deception. Hearing him casually plan my financial ruin while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage was like receiving a final confirmation of how completely he'd betrayed our relationship. Mike's attorney requested a brief recess to consult with her client, and I watched them huddle in urgent conversation near the window. Mike's gestures were animated, probably trying to convince his lawyer that he could still find a way out of the increasingly desperate situation. When they returned to the table, Mike's attorney's expression had shifted from defensive to resigned. The evidence was too overwhelming to deny, and she clearly understood that her client's best option was damage control rather than continued resistance. "Mr. Thompson is prepared to discuss settlement terms," she announced, "provided that any agreement includes confidentiality provisions and protection from additional civil claims." Judge Williams turned to Lauren and me, her eyebrows raised in inquiry. The offer was essentially Mike's surrender, an acknowledgement that he couldn't continue fighting the evidence we'd gathered. Lauren consulted her notes before responding. "We're willing to discuss settlement, Your Honor, but our terms reflect the scope of financial fraud we've documented. Mr. Thompson's actions require consequences that ensure Mrs. Martinez receives full compensation for her losses." What followed was 3 hours of intense negotiation that felt like watching Mike's life systematically dismantled. Every asset he'd tried to hide was identified and allocated for recovery. Every financial manipulation was countered with specific restitution requirements. The business he'd built with David Kim would need to be restructured to ensure client funds were protected and properly accounted for. Most importantly, Mike would be required to liquidate his Denver investments and return the money he'd stolen from our joint accounts. The condo he'd purchased for his new life with Ashley would need to be sold, with proceeds going toward my settlement. Even his stake in Thompson and Kim Realty would be partially transferred to compensate for his embezzlement of business funds. By the time the negotiations concluded, Mike would be left with minimal assets and significant debt, forced to rebuild his career from scratch while facing ongoing criminal investigations. The elaborate escape plan he'd spent months developing had become the mechanism of his own destruction. Ashley arrived at the courthouse during the final hour of negotiations, her presence creating an additional layer of tension in an already charged atmosphere. She looked exhausted and overwhelmed, clearly struggling with the implications of what she'd learned about Mike's criminal behavior. When the settlement terms were finalized, Mike was required to sign documents acknowledging his fraud and agreeing to cooperate with ongoing law enforcement investigations. The man who'd thought he was too clever to face consequences was now legally bound to help expose the full scope of his own crimes. As Mike signed each document, his hands shaking slightly with what might have been anger or fear, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction or revenge, but a profound sense of closure. The man I'd loved had never really existed. He'd been a carefully constructed facade hiding someone capable of systematic betrayal and criminal behavior. Judge Williams concluded the conference by explaining the monitoring provisions that would ensure Mike's compliance with the settlement terms. His financial activities would be subject to ongoing oversight, and any attempt to hide additional assets would result in immediate criminal referral. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Williams said in conclusion, "you've demonstrated a pattern of deception that extends far beyond your marriage. This settlement gives you an opportunity to make amends for your actions and rebuild your life honestly. I strongly suggest you take advantage of that opportunity." Mike nodded silently, looking like a man who'd finally understood the full cost of his choices. The confidence and charm that had once defined him had been completely stripped away, leaving someone diminished and defeated. As we prepared to leave the courthouse, Ashley approached me hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to thank you for not destroying him completely. I know you could have pushed for criminal charges that would have made it impossible for him to support the baby." Her gratitude was touching but misplaced. I hadn't made those choices to protect Mike. I'd made them to protect an innocent child who deserved a father capable of providing support even if that father had proven himself unworthy of trust. "Take care of yourself and the baby," I told her, meaning it sincerely. "And don't let Mike convince you that what happened here was anyone's fault but his own." Ashley nodded, tears threatening to spill over as she absorbed the weight of everything that had been revealed. She was facing single motherhood with a man whose character had been exposed as fundamentally dishonest, and I genuinely hoped she had the strength to make decisions that prioritized her and her child's well-being. Lauren and I walked out of the courthouse into brilliant Colorado sunshine, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. The settlement had exceeded even Lauren's optimistic projections, recovering not just the money Mike had stolen, but additional compensation for the fraud and emotional damages his deceptions had caused. "How do you feel?" Lauren asked as we reached our cars. It was a complicated question. The financial victory was satisfying, and the legal vindication was important, but the emotional cost of discovering who I'd really been married to was something that would take time to fully process. "Free," I said finally, and realized it was true. For the first time in years, I feel completely free to make my own choices without worrying about someone else's hidden agenda. Lauren smiled, the expression of someone who'd seen many clients emerge from devastating betrayals stronger than they'd entered them. "That's the best possible outcome from something like this. Mike thought he was taking your future away, but he actually gave you the chance to build a better one." Over the following weeks, the settlement terms were implemented with the kind of efficiency that comes from having overwhelming evidence and a defeated opponent. Mike's assets were liquidated according to the court order, generating enough funds to not only restore my financial security, but provide a substantial foundation for whatever came next. The house in Riverside became truly mine, no longer a reminder of shared dreams that had been built on lies. I paid off the mortgage completely and began the process of renovating it to reflect my own tastes rather than compromises made for a relationship that had been fundamentally dishonest. David Kim reached out several times, ostensibly to apologize for his partner's behavior, but actually trying to minimize his own potential liability in the ongoing criminal investigations. His real estate license was suspended pending the outcome of the State Commission's inquiry, and Thompson and Kim Realty was dissolved as part of the settlement agreement. Most surprising was a call from Robert Sterling, my boss at the marketing firm, offering me a partnership stake in the company. The Lake Tahoe campaign I'd completed just before discovering Mike's betrayal had led to several additional contracts, and Robert wanted to formalize my role in the business. "I've been watching how you've handled this personal crisis," Robert explained during our meeting. "The same strategic thinking and determination you've shown in dealing with your divorce is exactly what this company needs to grow. You've proven that you can turn impossible situations into victories." The offer was generous and unexpected, providing both financial opportunity and the chance to build something entirely my own. It represented a future based on my own abilities and choices rather than compromises made for someone else's benefit. I accepted the partnership, signing papers that made me an owner rather than just an employee. The symbolism felt important, building something new from the ashes of what Mike had tried to destroy. Rachel helped me redecorate the house, painting walls in colors I'd always loved but had avoided because Mike preferred neutral tones. We replaced furniture that held memories of our marriage with pieces that reflected my own personality and preferences. "You look different," Rachel observed one afternoon as we assembled a new dining room table. "Not just happier, but more like yourself than you've been in years." She was right. The process of fighting for what I deserved had reminded me of strengths I'd forgotten I possessed. The woman who'd discovered her husband's betrayal had been devastated and confused. The woman who'd emerged from the legal battle was someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't accept being treated as disposable. Mrs. Hayes continued to be an invaluable neighbor, sharing updates about the ongoing FBI investigation that had expanded to include several other real estate professionals suspected of similar financial crimes. Mike's case had apparently opened a larger investigation into industry practices in Colorado and neighboring states. "That young man thought he was so clever," Mrs. Hayes said over coffee one morning. "But dishonesty always catches up with people. Eventually. The truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it." Her words proved prophetic when news broke that Mike had been formally charged with federal wire fraud and money laundering in connection with his embezzlement of client funds. The charges carried potential prison sentences that would effectively end his real estate career permanently. Ashley moved back to Denver to be near her family, finally accepting her mother's advice to distance herself from someone whose criminal behavior made him an unsuitable partner for raising a child. Carmen called to let me know that Ashley was doing well and had found work that would allow her to support herself independently. "My daughter learned hard lessons about trusting the wrong person," Carmen said. "But she is strong. She will build a good life for herself and the baby without depending on someone who proved he cannot be trusted." I felt genuine relief knowing that Ashley had found the strength to prioritize her own well-being over whatever promises Mike had made about their future together. His pattern of manipulation and deception made him dangerous to anyone who trusted him completely. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, but Mike's attorney was already discussing plea negotiations to avoid the lengthy prison sentence he faced if convicted on all charges. The evidence Lauren and I had helped gather was apparently central to the prosecution's case against him. I wouldn't need to testify unless the case went to trial, but I was prepared to do so if necessary. The man who'd threatened me during our phone conversation deserved to face the full consequences of his choices, regardless of how uncomfortable that made him. Winter arrived early in Riverside, covering the mountains in snow that made everything look clean and fresh. I established new routines that reflected my preferences rather than accommodations made for someone else's schedule. Morning coffee. On the deck facing the mountains. Evening walks through downtown that ended at the bookstore I'd always loved, but rarely had time to visit. Lauren and I became closer friends through the shared experience of the legal battle, bonding over dinners, where we discussed everything except divorce law. She introduced me to hiking trails I'd never explored, and convinced me to join a book club that met monthly at the local library. "You're building the life you should have had all along," Lauren observed one evening as we watched sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "Mike thought he was taking your future away, but he actually freed you to create something better." The insight felt profound. Mike's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also forced me to examine assumptions about love, trust, and personal worth that I'd never questioned while we were married. The woman who'd emerged from that examination was stronger and more self-aware than the one who'd discovered his affair. 6 months after the settlement, I received an unexpected letter from Ashley, written in careful handwriting and postmarked from Denver. She'd given birth to a healthy baby girl and wanted to share the news with someone who'd treated her kindly during the worst period of her life. "I named her Sophia, which means wisdom," Ashley wrote. "I chose it because this whole experience taught me the importance of seeing people clearly rather than believing what I want to believe about them. I hope she grows up to be smarter about trust than her mother was." The letter included a photo of a beautiful baby with dark hair and serious eyes. Looking at Sophia's face, I felt hope for her future despite the circumstances of her birth. Ashley had shown real courage in choosing to build an independent life rather than depending on someone whose character had proven unreliable. I wrote back to congratulate Ashley and offer support if she ever needed it, though I suspected she was strong enough to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. Her experience with Mike had been painful but educational, teaching lessons about self-reliance that would serve her well as a single mother. Spring brought news that Mike had accepted a plea agreement requiring him to serve 18 months in federal prison and pay substantial restitution to the clients whose money he'd stolen. His real estate license was permanently revoked, and he would be prohibited from working in financial services for the rest of his life. The sentence felt appropriate given the scope of his crimes, though I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. The man I'd thought I'd married had never really existed, so his destruction was more like watching a stranger face consequences for choices that had affected my life, but weren't really my responsibility. David Kim received probation and community service after cooperating fully with the investigation and helping recover additional stolen funds. His real estate license was suspended for 5 years, effectively ending his career in the industry, but he avoided prison time by demonstrating that he hadn't participated knowingly in Mike's embezzlement. With the legal proceedings finally concluded, I focused on building the marketing partnership that Robert had offered. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that reminded me why I'd chosen the profession originally. Solving complex problems. For clients required the same strategic thinking that had served me so well during the divorce proceedings. The partnership flourished beyond anyone's expectations, landing several major contracts that established Sterling Martinez Marketing as one of the premier firms in Colorado. The financial success was gratifying, but more important was the sense of building something lasting based on my own abilities and integrity. I began dating again slowly, meeting people through work and social activities who knew nothing about my previous marriage or the legal battle that had ended it. The experience of starting fresh was both liberating and terrifying, requiring me to trust my own judgment about character and compatibility. The lessons Mike had taught me about deception and manipulation made me more cautious, but also more confident in my ability to recognize genuine character. I'd learned the difference between charm and authenticity, between promises and actions, between love and control. 1 year after discovering Mike's betrayal, I stood on the deck of my renovated house, watching snow fall on the mountains and marveling at how completely my life had changed. The woman who'd built her identity around being a supportive wife to someone who'd never deserved that support had become someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't compromise it for anyone. The house felt warm and welcoming in ways it never had when Mike lived there, filled with books and art and furniture that reflected my actual preferences rather than compromises made for a relationship built on lies. Every room told the story of someone who'd reclaimed her life from people who'd tried to diminish it. Mrs. Hayes stopped by that evening with homemade soup and the latest neighborhood gossip, settling into my kitchen like the surrogate grandmother she'd become during the difficult months of legal proceedings. "You know," she said, watching me stir honey into my tea, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone handle adversity with as much grace as you did. That husband of yours thought he could break you, but he just made you stronger." Her words carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed decades of human drama and understood the difference between people who were destroyed by betrayal and people who were transformed by it. Mike's attempts to manipulate and control me had ultimately taught me lessons about strength I never would have learned otherwise. As Mrs. Hayes left, she paused at the door with a knowing smile. "I have a feeling your best chapters are still ahead of you, dear. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in soil that's been through the harshest storms." Standing in my doorway watching her navigate the snowy walkway, I felt the truth of her words settling in my chest like warm light. Mike had tried to write the ending of my story, had attempted to reduce me to a disposable character in his narrative of self-serving escape. Instead, his betrayal had become the beginning of a story I was writing entirely for myself, one chapter at a time, with no one else holding the pen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.